Hi, good afternoon. I'm Alina Méndez. I am a Mellon Fellow at SAR this academic year. And before I begin my presentation, I would like to acknowledge the Tewa and Tanos people on whose ancestral lands I stand here today. I would also like to thank all the folks here at SAR who make it possible for my fellow resident scholars and I to spend time away from institutional responsibilities and work on our projects. And lastly, I would like to thank all of those of you who are tuning in this afternoon and, hearing about my work. Now, I would like to begin by showing you a photograph that the New York Times published on March 27, 1951, titled "The Typical Wetback Village Near U.S. Border." The image depicted what the caption explained were some of the homes in Mexicali that are made of cardboard, sticks, and scrap iron, and that house thousands of the illegal Mexican immigrants. The article that this photograph accompanied reported that U.S. Representative Emanuel Seller had announced plans for an investigation of undocumented migration across the Mexican border. And I began with this image because for me, what is really striking is that the homes are in Mexicali, Baja California, in Mexico. Even though the people living in these homes were lawfully residing in their country of origin, the New York Times described them as wetbags or illegal immigrants. The unauthorized legal status that they held in the U.S. for a few hours every day or for a few months at a time, in other words, followed them into Mexico. Another important detail of this photograph is that the newspaper really captured the relationship between Mexicali, Baja California, and its U.S. neighbor, California's Imperial Valley. This so-called wetback village had sprung up in Mexicali because it served as a bedroom community for the Imperial Valley and other parts of the Southwest. And before I go more into this relationship between Mexicali and the Imperial Valley, I will provide you some context about this Borderlands region and why unauthorized migration was becoming an important national issue by 1951. Mexicali is the capital of Baja California Norte, and it is situated just south of the Imperial Valley, which constitutes California's southeastern corner. The highlighted region in the map on the right is Imperial County. Calexico is on the border. It is Mexicali's twin city. They are across, the fence from each other, across the U.S.-Mexico border. El Centro is the county seat. This is where the Bracero Reception Center, which I'll be discussing in a few minutes, was located. And Brawley is about half an hour north of the border. It was the largest city in the Imperial Valley in the mid-20th century. This Borderlands region experienced many socioeconomic changes during the Bracero Program era. The Bracero Program was a binational labor agreement between Mexico and the U.S. that began in 1942 when the U.S. joined World War II. The Mexican men who participated in the program as contracted workers were called braceros, and the men who aspired to obtain a contract were called aspirantes. And I should note that only men participated in the Bracero Program. One of the conditions that Mexico set to participate in the guest worker agreement was that only men would travel to the U.S. The idea was that if only men traveled to the U.S., whole families would not resettle to the U.S. The men would feel obligated to return for their wives, children, mothers, sisters, etc. Although the program continued until 1964, it was plagued by controversy since the mid-1940s. At the end of World War II, former servicemen and defense workers began returning to agricultural communities to find that their jobs were now in the hands of braceros, or undocumented migrants. The Imperial Valley Mexicali Borderlands region began attracting national media attention, moreover, when the National Farm Labor Union, which had a large Mexican-American membership, organized several strikes across the Imperial Valley in the early 1950s, publicly opposing the Bracero Program. This photograph shows a routine medical examination that every aspirante had to pass in order to become a contracted worker. Braceros usually went through a medical examination in Mexico at a recruitment center, and then they went through another secondary medical examination when they crossed the border in the reception center, such as the one in El Centro. The most profound transformation that the program generated in the region was a demographic explosion in Mexicali. As you can see from the numbers on the slide, the state's population almost tripled between 1940 and 1950, then more than doubled by 1960. This was because migrants hoping to obtain employment in the Imperial Valley utilized Mexicali as a springboard or staging area to then cross into the U.S. Others who had labored in the U.S. and returned to Mexico or were deported to Mexicali spent days, weeks, or months figuring out whether they were going to go back to central Mexico or try to re-enter the United States. The Mexican border town, in other words, was a receptacle for unemployed or deported migrants. The shipping label on this slide shows that Imperial Valley growers promoted the region as a winter garden because its main crops were harvested during the fall and winter months. My project thus examines the many ways in which the Bracero Program transformed the Imperial Valley Mexicali borderlands, but also how the trans-border region shaped the guest worker program. The project's central argument is that Mexicali subsidized Imperial Valley agribusiness by absorbing many of the costs of labor social reproduction in the region. As I previously mentioned, the Bracero Program and the Imperial Valley's turn to migrant labor produced an enormous amount of internal migration to the Borderlands region. The border separating Mexicali from the Imperial Valley ensured that most migrants settled on the Mexican side. And when I refer to the border, I don't mean the 3-mile fence that separated Mexicali and Calexico in the early 1940s when the program began, but the threat of deportability that every undocumented migrant experienced if they were on the U.S. side of the border. This meant that Mexicali had to respond to increased demands on housing, healthcare, education, and other public services. One of the guiding principles I have followed with my research is to avoid and challenge methodological nationalism. Andrea Wimmer and Nina Glick-Schiller define this as a tendency by social scientists to adopt the perspective of the nation state. They warn against adhering to the bounds of nationalist thought, but also of emphasizing an extreme fluidism across borders that downplays the enormous power that borders still possess over most people's lives. I conducted my transnational archival research with these warnings in mind and view this methodology as one of my project's largest contributions. Some of you might be familiar with the history of Operation Wetback, which occurred in 1954. This was an infamous series of deportation sweeps that the Border Patrol executed across the Southwest, in which the agency declared had resulted in the deportation of more than 1 million undocumented migrants. Kelly Lairo Hernandez has shown that the Border Patrol exaggerated these numbers, and the operation was more of a publicity stunt than an actual massive sweep across the U.S. Southwest. Many of the migrants who were apprehended in Los Angeles and other parts of California, as shown in this image, were deported to Mexico via Calexico, as shown in this other photograph. What is less known is that just a few months before Operation Wetback, the U.S. opened its borders to Mexican immigrants through Mexicali. One of the most memorable images to come out of this period is this photograph where a Mexican immigration official is pulling a migrant towards Mexicali, while one man on the Calexico side is pulling the migrant towards Calexico, towards the U.S. side. It all began when the binational agreement that made the Bracero Program possible expired at the end of 1953. After a 15-day extension, the program expired, and the U.S. announced it would not renew its agreement with Mexico. Instead, it would launch a unilateral program of border contracting at the U.S.-Mexico border. The Mexican government quickly responded to the plan, saying it was against unilateral contracting at the U.S.-Mexico border, and it prohibited its citizens from participating in the program. Despite Mexico's public opposition, the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service, hereafter I refer to it as INS, opened the Calexico port of entry on January 22. Since the Mexican government posted federal guards at the border, as we can see here, many migrants chose to jump the fence in order to enter the United States. But because the Department of Labor required that every immigrant enter through an official port of entry in order to work legally in the U.S., the INS instructed undocumented migrants to place a foot on Mexican soil and then re-enter as legal immigrant workers. And I should mention that this practice of formalizing the legal status of undocumented migrants had begun in 1947 when the INS would apprehend undocumented migrants. They would take them to the U.S.-Mexico border, instruct the migrants to place a foot on Mexican soil, and then re-enter as now legal migrants. And this process was known as drying out. The idea was that undocumented migrants were wetbacks, and the idea of returning to the border and re-entering as now a legal migrant was drying them out. This process illustrates what anthropologist Nicholas de Genova has termed the legal production of migrant illegality, the spectacle of what the press humorously called border tag, and the hundreds of men pressing against the border fence made illegality visible and natural. The INS processed more than 6,000 migrants during the 15 days in which the U.S. operated a unilateral program of border contracting in Mexicali. When asked why the INS was not processing more workers, considering that thousands of them were waiting to cross the U.S.-Mexico border, the manager of the El Centro Reception Center told the local media that they were not creating a labor pool because it would lead to a boarding problem. The reception center is where braceros went once they crossed the U.S.-Mexico border. They were examined there, and then employers went to the reception center, identified the workers they wanted to hire. Both parties signed a contract, and growers could then transport braceros to their place of work. Here I emphasize that Mexicali also lacked the facilities to house the thousands of internal migrants who had rushed to the border upon hearing the news of border contracting. The federal agents working for the INS and the Labor Department in the Imperial Valley, in other words, knew well that overcrowding and the problems that come with it would remain Mexicali's problems. The unilateral contracting of braceros at the border could conveniently ignore the problems that this was causing in Mexicali. Though short-lived, the unilateral program introduced several major changes to bracero recruitment and employment. As a guest worker agreement, the Bracero Program had required contracted workers, meaning braceros, to live in the U.S. The idea was they're guest workers, they're living in the U.S. or working in the U.S. The unilateral program, however, permitted employers to pay braceros for their daily border commuting expenses if the growers did not have what were considered suitable living facilities. Daily border commuting, more than just freeing employers of the housing obligations stipulated by the Bracero Program, also substantially lowered workers' cost of living. Ramon Flores Gonzalez, for example, worked as a bracero on a ranch located 5 miles outside of Calexico. Since his employer did not own a labor camp or homes for the workers, Flores Gonzalez and his fellow braceros lived in a hotel in Calexico. Their employer picked them up every morning and transported them to the fields. In his interview with the Bracero History Archive, Flores Gonzalez noted that he and other men ate and bought meals in Mexicali while they lived in a Calexico hotel because food was cheaper across the border. At this point in time, crossing the U.S.-Mexico border was not a matter of hours, it was a matter of minutes. The option of doing away with border housing, of course, was largely dependent on a grower's geographic proximity to the border. If employers could get braceros to fields early in the morning and back to the border by evening, they could take advantage of the new labor arrangement. Another important feature of the temporary unilateral program gave growers the option of pre-naming the workers who they wanted to contract in their farms. Although the number of undocumented migrants who worked in the Imperial Valley was always debated, it was widely known that as many unauthorized workers labored in the valley at any one time as braceros, oftentimes more. Many of these men worked for the same foreman, crew leader, or farmer every year. Some employers preferred to hire unauthorized workers because they knew exactly who they were hiring, unlike the random system of the Bracero Program that assigned people to all over mainly the U.S. Southwest, but other parts of the Midwest as well. And of course, growers could pay undocumented workers less. But the unilateral program allowed employers to pre-name the men they wanted to contract, many who had been undocumented up to this point. When the governments of Mexico and the U.S. resumed the Bracero Program in mid-March, this new option of pre-naming workers was incorporated into the agreement. The U.S. had shown Mexico that it would operate a Bracero Program with or without Mexican cooperation. So not only was the Mexican government forced to accept this new practice, but also border contracting, something it had staunchly opposed since 1942. Mexican officials knew very well that border contracting would produce transient populations in border cities and had insisted on recruiting workers in the Mexican interior. The enormous demographic growth that Baja California experienced between 1940 and 1950, however, demonstrates that aspirantes had flocked to the border despite the government's public opposition to internal migration. In other words, braceros, aspirantes were not paying attention to what the Mexican government was trying to organize. If the U.S. government allowed growers to pre-name their workers and to employ them as commuter braceros, it is because southwestern growers had spent years demanding these and other concessions. The Imperial Valley Farmers Association was, according to its secretary, the largest single employer of braceros in 1954 and reportedly employed from 3,500 to 9,200 braceros throughout the year. Representatives of the association often met with government officials in Washington, D.C. and in Mexico City. The association represented farmers who actually participated in the Bracero program, the ones who employed migrants through official channels. But the fact is that most small farms employed undocumented migrants, and this was not just in the Imperial Valley, but across the U.S. Southwest. The INS launched Operation Wetback and the special program, which I will get to in a minute, to decrease the employment of unauthorized workers and increase grower participation in the guest worker program. If Operation Wetback was the stick that tried to force Southwestern growers to give up their unauthorized labor, the specials program was the carrot. This program, the special program, gave growers the option of rating braceros as special or skilled key men, a rating that was then recorded on each worker's I-100 card. And this I-100 card was a laminated identification card that every bracero received at the end of their contract. Labor organizer and scholar Ernesto Galarza called the contracted workers who had become a permanent seasonal labor force in the Imperial Valley Bracero professionals. This card, for example, was given to a bracero who worked in the area north of the Imperial Valley and identified him as an experienced worker. The special program, in fact, began in the Imperial Valley and then spread to other regions across the U.S. Southwest. And it began there because the practice of pre-naming workers was already widespread, as some growers paid Mexican officials between $10 and $25 in bribes for every trained bracero that returned to their farms. So instead of receiving a random bracero every year, every season, they paid bribes to receive the same workers who they knew were trained, were reliable, etc. Though the Mexican government opposed the special program, it continued until July 1960. And the reason why Mexico opposed it was because the rating system served as a strong disciplinary tool that gave growers even more power over their contracted workers. Alberto Magallon Jimenez, for instance, mentioned in his Bracero History Archive interview that he made sure to always appear very respectful to his supervisors in order to keep his status as a special bracero. Though other men derided him and other specials for being barberos or suck-ups, Magallon Jimenez made sure to avoid coming off as a contestón, insolent, malcriado, unmannerly, or huevón, lazy. This approach, however problematic some found it, gave relative job stability and permanence to specials and allowed more and more bracero families to settle in Mexicali. Magallon Jimenez had worked in the Imperial Valley as a bachelor. After marrying his longtime girlfriend, he returned to the Imperial Valley accompanied by his wife. She ultimately settled in Mexicali, while Magallon Jimenez worked first as an undocumented worker and then as a special bracero. The wages he earned in the U.S. enabled him to buy land in Mexicali and start building an adobe house there. We can easily understand why Magallon Jimenez was willing to be a compliant and hardworking bracero in order to gain the economic stability that his special status provided him. He and every other bracero knew that for every man who held a labor contract, there were dozens of aspirantes hoping to obtain employment in the United States. A week and a half after the U.S. launched its unilateral program of border contracting in late January, for example, estimates put the number of men awaiting to cross through Mexicali between 9,000 and 12,000. Thousands of them slept on the street, begged for money when their savings ran out, and according to the local press, engaged in petty theft. Once the Bracero program resumed in mid-March, a total of 27,114 workers registered in Mexicali alone for participation in the program. And these 27,114 workers registered in a matter of only 2 weeks. So we're talking about massive, massive populations, groups awaiting at the Mexicali border to enter through the Calexico port of entry. Mexicali's transient population increased even further with Operation Wetback. The large publicity campaign that preceded the sweeps gave thousands of migrants enough time to travel to border cities like Mexicali to avoid apprehension and then return to the U.S. after the sweeps had passed through their particular region of residence and work. Let's remember that the U.S. government had called on Mexican aspirantes to go to the U.S. border to participate in the unilateral program in January. The government simply made the call and selected the workers it required, leaving thousands of aspirantes awaiting an opportunity in Mexicali. It was then up to the city, state, and federal authorities on the Mexican side to solve Mexicali's overcrowding. Several months later, the U.S. then launched Operation Wetback, and it was again Mexico's responsibility to cope with the overcrowding that this produced in Mexican border cities. In response to the so-called migrant crisis, the governor of Baja California adopted a plan to deter aspirantes in central Mexico from traveling north, to help those already in Mexicali to return to their home communities, or to cement those who wish to stay in their new city and state. The governor made this approach clear in the State of the State report that he sent to the president's office in October 1954. Baja California had spent more than 100,000 pesos on railroad passes, food, medicine, and local transportation for internal migrants by March of 1954. This was before operation began in June of 1954. It sent thousands of internal migrants back to central Mexico throughout the summer and into September of that year. Between June 30 and July 9, this was already during Operation Wetback, for instance, the state sent a daily average of 433 internal migrants to central states like Jalisco, Michoacán, and Guanajuato, which we know were historically sending regions in the mid-20th century. We may find Baja California's approach a bit contradictory, but the state's response to internal migration in fact reflects the larger shift that the Mexican federal government made in the 20th century. Up until the Bracero Program, Mexico opposed immigration and tried preventing it at the local and regional levels. By the 1970s, however, the Mexican government abandoned this approach and actually welcomed and encouraged remittances of people in the U.S. to Mexico. While Baja California could do very little to prevent Mexicans' internal migration, it could in fact shape the political and social climate in which migrants became incorporated into the region. Eager to capture the dollars that male migrants could insert into the local economy, Governor Braulio Maldonado Sandes encouraged the reunification of Mexican families separated by the gender demands of the Bracero Program. With the Border Patrol pressuring undocumented migrant families to stay south of the border to prevent apprehension, Mexicali became not only a major staging ground for transients seeking entry into the U.S., but also the new home for families who ultimately settled in the region. Pressed by the continuous demographic growth of its population, Baja California state government became increasingly preoccupied with the expansion of urban services and an infrastructure celebrated as modern. The images that Baja California sent to Mexico City to the federal government emphasize the demographic growth, the urban services that were needed, the kind of changes that were happening in Baja California that the federal government had created, that federal policies were driving, but that Baja California was responding to these changes at the local level and sending images of new schools, new hospitals, where the justification that Baja California needed for federal funding. The state's accelerated urbanization during the 1940s is best reflected by the fact that in 1 year, from October 1954 to October 1955, 20 new colonias, or we would call them neighborhoods in the U.S., emerged in Mexicali. These neighborhoods were some of the most visible measures the state government adopted in support of impoverished migrants. The reality is that most of these new working-class neighborhoods lacked basic services such as running water or electricity. And although this map was included in the 1954 State of the State report that Baja California sent to the federal government in Mexico City, I suspect it was drawn much earlier. If you look at the image, Mexicali appears very small. The squares are city blocks, and the area surrounding those blocks are the cotton fields that became new colonias or working class neighborhoods as Mexicali continued expanding. Along with providing newcomers with basic urban services, Maldonado Sandes set out to create an image of a welcoming new state. In Baja California, up until 1952, had been a Mexican federal territory, and it was actually the demographic growth that the Bracero Program generated in Baja California that gave it its required population, enough population in Baja California to become a state. The governor described migrants as enterprising individuals who could make Baja California a prosperous land of immigrants. Baja California, he declared, quote, had always offered its open arms to its brothers from the interior who settled there, engaged in clean, honest work, and increased the state's prosperity, end quote. Maldonado Sanders understood well that Baja California's response to internal migration would shape the fate of the state for decades to come. 1954 is thus a pivotal year because the changes introduced in the Bracero Program and the response that Baja California showed towards internal migration cemented the interdependence between Imperial Valley agribusiness and Mexicali. Mexicali had become the place where the Imperial Valley's reserve army of labor was to maintain itself and reproduce. Now here I'm skipping to 1960 when the special program ended. Always a step ahead of the changes occurring in the Bracero program, the Imperial Valley Farmers Association warned growers about the end of the special program a few months before its end in July. Before growers could become alarmed by the loss of their special favored workers, the association informed the growers that Mexicans could get regular immigration papers, meaning permanent resident cards, and stay in the region. As advised by the Farmer Association, Imperial Valley growers rushed to secure their access to workers they had employed for years under the special program. They achieved this by providing braceros the letters of support necessary to become legal permanent residents. In this way, many of the Mexican men who had labored in the Imperial Valley as specials and lived in Mexicali accompanied by their families continued commuting across the U.S.-Mexico border, but now as green card braceros. And I can speak about this more in our Q&A session, but one of the things that we've seen, for example, in the oral history interviews that the Bracero History Archive collected, was that many of the men who labored as braceros in the Imperial Valley recall being approached by crew leaders, foremen, growers, and being told that the special program is about to end, and being given assistance, the letters of support they needed, the money that was required to apply for a permanent residence card, all this kind of help that growers were willing and happy to provide to the special braceros. And we also learned that as braceros became special or as they obtained a legal permanent resident card, they often made the decision to bring their wives, their children, their sisters, their mothers to Mexicali. As they felt more secure in terms of financial employment stability, they made the move to Mexicali. This permanent shift to commuters, of course, did not happen without some resistance from Imperial Valley residents. One of the individuals who most strongly opposed the employment of border commuters was Benjamin Yellen, a Brawley physician and activist. Yellen became interested in labor issues after treating many braceros who had been victims of medical malpractices and medical insurance fraud. Although sympathetic to the plight of Mexican guest workers, Yellen's attitude had shifted by 1962. Instead of collecting testimonies from aggrieved braceros, he began documenting the complaints of U.S. citizens and longtime residents. Yellen found an opportunity to expose the Imperial Valley's labor market changes when the Texas AFL-CIO sued the federal government in 1962 to prohibit the employment of green card commuters in South Texas. He wrote to the judge and indicated his desire to enter as amicus curiae. He wrote, quote, "The big farmers of Imperial Valley have gone into a big-time operation of offering jobs to Mexicans and paying the money involved in becoming legal immigrants," and then he put this all in caps, "on the expectation that the immigrant will then live in Mexico and cross the border to work. There is no such thing as bringing the family of the Mexican into the United States," end quote. Yellen also explained that with the low wages that border commuters were earning, they could not afford to live with their families in the U.S. Arguing that if there ever was a racket, this was it, he pointed to the way employers were misusing immigration law to externalize workers' social reproduction to Mexicali. The Brawley physician was not the only one who condemned the changes in the Imperial Valley's labor market. In an October 1964 letter to the editor of the Brawley News, Sal Juarez, a self-identified El Centro resident, called for the next California State Assembly to void all the green cards of commuters who were working in stores, hotels, welding shops, and in many other skilled occupations. If green card holders were immigrants, Juarez asked, why then was the law being violated by allowing them to live in a foreign country? Expressing a sentiment that had become increasingly common among Valley residents, Juarez added, quote, "Let us protect ourselves and our children and stop these green card braceros that have invaded every phase of means of living. Yes, we locals will not do stoop labor because we are too lazy, too educated, too dependent on welfare laws. Then let the braceros come in. but cut out this farce of green cards as mechanics, painters, etc." End quote. Juarez, in other words, was not opposed to the Bracero program that matched guest workers with the stoop labor that the so-called locals refused to do. What he did oppose was migrant workers taking over the positions considered as skilled jobs and that paid higher wages. While agribusiness had driven the turn to a commuter labor force, other industries and employers were now drawing from Mexicali's growing labor pool to reduce labor costs. And as you can see in this slide, the New York Times was reporting in April 1965, this was a few months after the official end of the Bracero program, that braceros were now border commuters in the Imperial Valley. Although commuter workers had been part of the Imperial Valley's labor market since the early 20th century, the Bracero program generated the conditions for the system to operate at a far larger scale than ever before. Internal migration increased the size of Mexicali, and the gendered restrictions of the guest worker program ensured that families settled on the Mexican side, where men labored across the border in the U.S. Mexico had become a merchant of labor under the Bracero program, supplying the United States with a cheap and convenient reserve army of labor. And I should note that Ernesto Galarza, the labor organizer and scholar that I mentioned before, coined the term merchant of labor in a book by the same name, where he condemned what the U.S. was doing. He argued that the U.S. was acting as a merchant of labor for agribusiness, for the profit, for the benefit of agribusiness. When we examine the Bracero program in the Imperial Valley Mexicali borderlands, we can easily recognize a pivotal role that the state played in opening and closing borders for the advantage of agribusiness in the mid-20th century. The Bracero program provided the Imperial Valley a perfect system by which to externalize the costs of social reproduction to Mexico. And we're all familiar with the images that Dorothea Lange took during the Great Depression. Many scholars argue that these images were so striking because they portrayed a phenomenon that was not supposed to exist, an image of white poverty in the United States. Although the New York Times paid attention to the wetback village in Mexicali, the houses shown in that image were perceived as natural, a foreign poverty that was not native to the U.S. The Bracero families who settled in Mexicali were the ideal labor force because the men provided labor during seasonal times of need and then returned to the city across the border, ready to be called on the next season. Their families and their poverty, unlike that of so-called domestic workers, remained in Mexico. There, the families had to cope with seasonal unemployment. What this project demonstrates is that no family wants to live separated. When the opportunity to live in close proximity was available, thousands of families resettled to Mexicali. I end this presentation by reminding my dear listeners that it is imperative that we include social reproduction in conversations about immigration reform. The braceros and unauthorized migrants who worked in the Imperial Valley were cheap labor because their social reproduction was externalized to Mexico. They were welcomed as workers in the U.S., but denied residence and social membership in American society. Today, documented and undocumented immigrants across the country face increasing attacks on their social reproduction. State and local governments are targeting migrant communities by slashing social programs that help the most vulnerable. On the other hand, the threat of deportation enables American capital to reap the benefits of a cheap labor that makes no claims on the state. As the current attacks on immigrants leave more than clear, immigrant communities are still paying the price of their cheap labor. And I end here. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your questions.